Marcus Sterling sat alone at table 17 in the corner of Romano's restaurant every evening at exactly 6:30, the same expensive meal untouched before him, while his cold blue eyes scanned quarterly reports, never knowing that in 3 weeks a 5-year-old girl with crayon-stained fingers would approach him with a folded piece of paper and shatter the fortress he had built around his heart for 7 long years, never suspecting that her innocent question about loneliness would crack open wounds he thought had scarred over, never imagining that this child and her struggling mother would become the family he thought he had lost forever when grief consumed everything he once was. The servers at Romano's moved around Marcus Sterling like shadows around a monument, silent and careful, their footsteps deliberately soft against the polished marble floors. He was a fixture now, as permanent as the crystal chandeliers that cast their golden light across the dining room, as unmovable as the mahogany bar that stretched along the eastern wall. 45 years old, impeccably dressed in suits that cost more than most people earned in months, he radiated power and wealth, and something else entirely, something that made even the boldest waiters hesitate before approaching his table. Giovanni, the head waiter who had served Romano's elite clientele for 30 years, called him the Ice King behind closed kitchen doors, though never with cruelty, always with a touch of sadness that came from watching a man slowly fade into his own isolation. Marcus arrived at precisely 6:30 every evening, his black town car pulling up to the entrance with mechanical punctuality, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the stone steps with the rhythm of a metronome, his tall frame moving through the restaurant with the purposeful stride of someone who had forgotten how to simply walk, who only knew how to march toward the next objective. He ordered the same meal without looking at the menu. Filet mignon cooked medium rare, asparagus, no potato, sparkling water with lime, never wine, never dessert, never variation. He ate methodically while reviewing documents on his tablet, signing contracts between bites, sending emails that determined the fates of thousands of employees across his tech empire, his fork moving to his mouth with the same calculated precision he applied to every merger and acquisition. The other diners whispered about him sometimes, speculating about the lonely billionaire who dined alone every single night. But Marcus never noticed them, never looked up from his glowing screen, never acknowledged the world beyond his table. Until that particular Tuesday evening in late September when his gaze drifted across the restaurant during a rare moment of distraction, and he saw them, a young woman in a simple waitress uniform and a small child with dark curls, sitting together at the least expensive table near the kitchen doors, sharing a single plate of pasta, their laughter somehow audible above the classical music and clinking silverware, their joy somehow visible despite their worn clothing and tired eyes, and something deep inside Marcus's chest tightened in a way he had not felt in 7 years. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Thank you. Sarah Chen was 32 years old and already felt like she had lived several lifetimes, each one carved from sacrifice and held together with the kind of quiet strength that goes unnoticed by the world but sustains it nonetheless. She had been a widow for 3 years, ever since the construction accident that took her husband David and left her with a 5-year-old daughter to raise alone, 2 jobs that barely covered rent, and a determination that burned brighter than any despair. Her day began at 5 in the morning cleaning office buildings downtown, her hands raw from chemicals and cold water, her back aching from bending over toilets and scrubbing floors that important people walked across without ever wondering who kept them gleaming. By noon, she slept for 3 hours in their tiny 1-bedroom apartment on the east side. The walls so thin she could hear the neighbors arguing, the ceiling stained with water damage that the landlord promised to fix but never did. The second-hand furniture arranged with care to make the cramped space feel like home. At 4 in the afternoon she woke, dressed Emma in the cleanest clothes they had, packed crayons and coloring books into a worn backpack, and brought her daughter to Romano's restaurant, where Sarah worked the evening shift as a waitress, moving between tables with a grace that came from necessity. Her smile genuine even when her feet screamed in protest, her patience endless even when customers treated her like she was invisible. Emma sat at the small table near the kitchen, the one reserved for staff meals, her little legs swinging beneath the chair, her dark eyes enormous in her delicate face, coloring pictures of houses with big yards and families holding hands, while her mother carried heavy trays and memorized orders and apologized for things that were not her fault. The restaurant owner, Mr. Romano, allowed this arrangement because Sarah never complained, never asked for favors, never let her exhaustion show to the customers who left generous tips for the pleasant waitress who seemed genuinely happy to serve them. Emma was a good child, remarkably well behaved for 5 years old, speaking in whispers, never running between tables, content to create worlds in crayon, while the wealthy dined on meals that cost more than her mother earned in a day. But Emma was also observant in the way children often are, noticing things adults missed, and she had been watching the man in the expensive suit who sat alone at table 17 every single evening, never smiling, never speaking to anyone, eating his food like it was a task to complete rather than a pleasure to enjoy, and she wondered with the innocent curiosity of childhood why someone who had everything looked so much like he had nothing at all. For 3 weeks, Emma had watched the lonely man at table 17, counting the days in her 5-year-old way, making marks on her coloring pages, noticing how he never looked up from his glowing rectangle, never spoke to the waiters except to nod, never smiled even once. And she wondered how someone could sit surrounded by beautiful things and delicious food and still look so terribly sad. Her mother had told her many times to stay at her table, to be good, to never bother the customers. But on this particular Wednesday evening, something inside Emma's small chest hurt when she saw the man staring at nothing, his fork frozen halfway to his mouth, his eyes empty in a way that reminded her of the lost puppy she had seen once behind their apartment building. She slipped from her chair before she could talk herself out of it, her worn sneakers silent on the carpet, her hands clutching a purple crayon, her heart beating fast with nervous courage as she approached the corner table where Marcus Sterling sat in his fortress of isolation. Marcus sensed the presence beside him and looked down with the irritation of someone unaccustomed to interruption, his expression cold and dismissive, but the words died on his lips when he saw the tiny girl with crayon-stained fingers and enormous dark eyes looking up at him with something that might have been concern. "Sir, my mom says you eat alone every day," Emma said in her small, clear voice, the words tumbling out before fear could stop them, her grip tightening on the purple crayon. Marcus stared at her, frozen, his mind scrambling to process this unprecedented breach of his carefully maintained boundaries, his mouth opening to deliver a polite but firm dismissal, but Emma continued with the fearless honesty of childhood. "Don't you get lonely?" she asked, her head tilting slightly, her eyes searching his face for an answer he had spent 7 years trying to bury. The question struck Marcus like a physical blow, piercing through layers of ice and armor and deliberate numbness, hitting something raw and wounded that he thought had died with his wife and son, and for a moment he could not breathe, could not think, could only stare at this child who had asked the one question no adult dared to voice. Sarah appeared suddenly, her face pale with mortification, her hands reaching for Emma's shoulders, her words tumbling out in a rush of apologies. "I am so sorry, sir. She is not usually like this. Please forgive us. She will not bother you again." Marcus forced his features into their usual mask of cold control, his voice emerging flat and distant when he finally spoke. "It's fine. Just please keep her at your table." His words clipped and dismissive, but his hands trembled slightly as he gripped his napkin, and Sarah noticed with surprise that his eyes, those cold blue eyes that never showed emotion, flickered with something that looked almost like pain before he turned back to his tablet and the fortress walls slammed shut once more. Marcus arrived at Romano's the following evening expecting nothing to be different, his routine unchanged by a child's innocent question, his walls rebuilt overnight through sheer force of will. But when he settled into his chair at table 17, he found himself glancing toward the staff table near the kitchen, where Emma sat coloring with fierce concentration, her tongue poking out slightly as she worked on something with unusual dedication. He looked away quickly, irritated with himself for noticing, for caring, for allowing even the smallest crack in his carefully constructed defenses. The meal arrived, the same as always, and he focused on his documents with renewed intensity, determined to forget the previous evening entirely. But then he heard the soft footsteps approaching and knew without looking that the small girl had returned. Marcus tensed, preparing to be firmer this time, to establish clear boundaries. But when he looked up, Emma was holding a piece of white paper folded in half, her expression serious and hopeful in equal measure. "I made this for you," she said simply, thrusting the paper toward him before he could respond. "Everyone should smile," she added with the absolute certainty of someone who believed happiness was a choice rather than a luxury. Marcus took the paper automatically, his fingers closing around it, and Emma smiled at him once, bright and genuine, before turning and running back to her table before her mother could notice she had moved. Marcus sat frozen, the folded paper in his hands, his heart suddenly beating too fast, his breath catching in his throat as he slowly opened the drawing and saw what the child had created for him. It was simple, executed in waxy crayons with the unsteady hand of a 5-year-old, a stick figure man sitting at a table with an enormous smile drawn across his circular face, yellow lines radiating from his head like sunshine. The word happy written in uneven letters across the top. The drawing blurred suddenly as Marcus stared at it. Memories flooding through the cracks Emma had created. Memories of another child's drawings, covering his refrigerator, of Thomas bringing home artwork from first grade with the same proud smile Emma had worn. Of Laura laughing as their son presented them with crayon masterpieces that they treasured like museum pieces. His hands trembled as he held Emma's gift. This simple gesture of kindness from a child who had nothing, who had every reason to guard her joy carefully, but instead gave it away freely to a stranger who sat alone in expensive suits and ate meals that cost more than her mother's weekly wages. Something deep inside Marcus's chest, something frozen and dead for 7 years, cracked open with an almost audible sound, and he found himself carefully folding the drawing and placing it in his jacket pocket instead of leaving it on the table, found himself unable to look at his tablet anymore, unable to pretend this moment had not mattered, unable to maintain the lie that he was fine, that he was whole, that he was anything other than a man drowning in isolation who had just been thrown a lifeline by the smallest, most unexpected hand. Marcus sat in his penthouse apartment that night, the city lights spreading below him like scattered diamonds. The drawing spread on his mahogany desk, where he had placed it with hands that still trembled slightly, unable to throw it away, unable to file it somewhere forgotten, unable to do anything but stare at the simple crayon lines and remember everything he had spent 7 years trying to forget. Laura had been his college sweetheart, brilliant and warm and full of laughter that made the whole world brighter. And Thomas had been their miracle, born after years of hoping, a 6-year-old whirlwind of energy and questions and artwork that covered every surface of their home. 7 years ago, on a rainy November evening, Marcus had stayed late at the office for a meeting that could have waited, and Laura had driven to pick up Thomas from soccer practice, and on the way home, a drunk driver ran a red light at 60 miles per hour and erased Marcus's entire world in a single terrible moment of twisted metal and shattered glass. He had thrown himself into work with the desperation of a drowning man, building sterling enterprises from a successful company into a billion-dollar empire, working 18-hour days, sleeping in his office, acquiring and merging and expanding until his name meant power and wealth and success, until everyone forgot he had once been a husband and father, until he almost forgot it himself. He had sold the family home because he could not bear to walk through rooms that echoed with Thomas's laughter, had donated Laura's belongings because touching her clothes made his hands shake, and locked away every photograph and drawing and memory until his penthouse became a sterile monument to nothing, beautiful and empty and cold as a tomb. But now this child's drawing sat on his desk, this simple gift from a girl who did not know his story, who only knew he looked lonely, and Marcus found himself unable to look away from it, unable to silence the voice in his head that sounded suspiciously like Laura telling him that 7 years was long enough to merely exist instead of live. The next evening, Marcus arrived at Romano's at his usual time. his movements automatic. But when he walked through the door, he found himself scanning the dining room before he could stop himself, looking for a small girl with dark curls and crayon-stained fingers. Emma spotted him first and waved with enthusiastic delight, her whole arm moving back and forth, her smile enormous and genuine. And Marcus felt his chest tighten as he managed the smallest nod in return, his face struggling with an expression it had not made in years. Romano, watching from behind the bar where he had witnessed Marcus Sterling's unchanging routine for months, nearly dropped the wine glass he was polishing, his eyes widening with shock at this microscopic crack in the Ice King's frozen exterior. And he wondered what magic this child possessed that could reach a man everyone else had given up as unreachable. The weeks that followed brought small changes that accumulated like snowflakes, building into something substantial and undeniable, each tiny gesture from Emma adding another layer of warmth to the ice that had encased Marcus's heart for so long. Some evenings she simply waved from her table, her whole hand moving enthusiastically while her crayons scattered across the paper. And Marcus found himself nodding in return, the gesture becoming less stiff each time, almost natural. Other nights she brought him drawings, always with the same theme of happiness: stick figures holding hands under bright suns, houses with flowers and smiling families, and Marcus accepted each one with hands that trembled less as the days passed, carefully placing them in his briefcase to join the growing collection on his desk at home. Once she approached with a cookie wrapped in a napkin, crumbs already escaping, explaining with solemn importance that she had made it herself in the restaurant kitchen with Chef Antonio's help, and Marcus had eaten it slowly while Emma watched with barely contained pride, the chocolate chip cookie tasting better than any five-star dessert he had consumed in years. Marcus began arriving at Romano's earlier, at 6:15 instead of 6:30, telling himself it had nothing to do with wanting more time, and he found himself staying later, ordering coffee he did not need, his tablet forgotten, as his eyes drifted toward the small girl who colored and occasionally looked his way with a smile that expected nothing but offered everything. His own smiles came gradually. First, just a slight softening around his eyes, then a barely visible upturn of his lips, until one evening he smiled fully when Emma showed him a drawing of a dinosaur she had made just for him, and the restaurant staff exchanged glances of amazement at this transformation they were witnessing. Sarah watched these interactions with a complicated mixture of worry and wonder. Afraid her daughter was bothering this important man, but unable to deny the change she saw in both of them, the way Emma's face lit up when Marcus acknowledged her, the way Marcus's rigid posture seemed to ease incrementally each evening. Finally, Sarah approached his table during a quiet moment, her hands twisting her apron nervously, her voice soft with apology. "I'm sorry, sir, my daughter can be very forward sometimes. I have told her not to bother you. Please let me know if she becomes a nuisance." Marcus looked up at her, really looked at her for the first time, seeing the exhaustion in her eyes and the dignity in her bearing, the love for her daughter evident in every worried line of her face. "She's not a bother," he said, his voice rough from disuse of genuine emotion. "She's fine. She's a good child." The words surprising them both with their sincerity, and Sarah felt tears prick her eyes at this simple kindness from a man who had seemed carved from stone just weeks before. Marcus found himself lingering at the bar one evening after his meal, something he had never done before, watching Mr. Romano polish glasses with the practiced ease of 3 decades in the restaurant business, and before he could stop himself the question emerged. "The woman who works here, Sarah, how long has she been with you?" Mr. Romano looked up with surprise, his weathered face showing curiosity at this unprecedented interest from the man who had never asked a personal question about anyone. 3 years now, Mr. Romano said, setting down his cloth. "She came to me after her husband died, construction accident, terrible thing. Left her with the little one and nothing else. She needed work, and I needed someone reliable. Best decision I ever made." Marcus felt something tighten in his chest as Mr. Romano continued, his voice warm with genuine respect. "She works 2 jobs, cleans offices before dawn, comes here in the afternoon, never complains, never asks for special treatment, just works with more dignity than people who have everything handed to them. And that little girl, Emma, she brings her because there is no one else to watch her, but the child is so well behaved, you would never know the hardship they face. Marcus nodded slowly, processing this information, understanding suddenly why Sarah's eyes held that particular exhaustion, why her smile seemed both genuine and hard-won, why she moved through the restaurant with the grace of someone who had learned to carry burdens without letting them show. He began observing her differently after that conversation, noticing things he had been too wrapped in his own isolation to see before. The way she handled difficult customers with patience that never wavered, even when they were rude or demanding, the gentle correction she gave a businessman who snapped his fingers at her like she was a servant. Her voice remaining soft but firm, as she reminded him kindly that please and thank you cost nothing. He saw how she hid her exhaustion behind that practiced smile, how her shoulders sagged slightly when she thought no one was watching, how she rubbed her lower back during brief moments between tables, the physical toll of her double life written in small gestures that most people missed. But most of all, Marcus noticed the way Sarah looked at Emma during stolen glances across the dining room, her entire face transforming with a love so pure and fierce it made his throat tight, the way she would pause in the middle of taking an order just to make sure her daughter was safe and content, the way she saved the best part of her staff meal to share with Emma even though she was clearly hungry herself, and Marcus understood with sudden clarity that he was witnessing the kind of selfless devotion he had once known in his own life, the kind of love that survives any hardship because it must, because giving up is simply not an option when someone else depends on you completely. Emma was sick one Thursday evening, a fever that flushed her small cheeks and made her eyes glassy with exhaustion, and Sarah had no choice but to bring her anyway, tucking her into a booth in the back with pillows borrowed from Mr. Romano's office and a blanket from the car, checking on her every few minutes between taking orders and delivering meals, her worry evident in the tight lines around her mouth and the way her hands shook slightly when she touched her daughter's forehead. Marcus watched from his corner table, his meal forgotten, seeing Sarah's distress multiply as the evening wore on. And when she finally took her break and sat beside Emma's sleeping form, her head in her hands, Marcus found himself standing and walking toward them before his mind could override the impulse. "Is she all right?" Marcus asked quietly, and Sarah looked up with surprise and exhaustion mingled in her expression, her guard immediately rising even as she forced a polite smile. "Just a fever, she will be fine. Thank you for asking, sir." Her voice steady despite the fear underneath. Marcus stood awkwardly, uncertain, his hands in his pockets. And then words emerged that he had not spoken in 7 years. "I had a son once," he said, his voice rough and low. "He got sick often when he was young. I remember that worry, that feeling like your heart is walking around outside your body." Sarah's eyes widened, her polite mask falling away as she truly looked at Marcus for the first time, seeing past the expensive suit and cold demeanor to the grief that lived beneath. "Had," she repeated softly, understanding in that single word. "Car accident," Marcus said, the words feeling like glass in his throat. 7 years ago, him and my wife Laura, both gone in a moment. Thomas was 6 years old. He loved drawing dinosaurs and asking questions about everything. Sarah's hand moved to her chest, her eyes filling with tears of genuine compassion. Not pity, but recognition of shared pain. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "My husband David died 3 years ago. Construction accident. Emma was only 2. She barely remembers him, and Marcus nodded because he understood perfectly the weight of raising a ghost alongside a living memory. They sat in silence for a moment, two strangers connected by loss and survival, and something shifted between them. A recognition that they were both warriors in a battle most people never saw, both carrying burdens that would crush weaker souls, both finding reasons to continue in the small hands that depended on them, and Marcus realized with startling clarity that this was the first real conversation he had experienced in 7 years. The first time he had felt seen as a human being rather than a title or a bank account. Emma recovered by the following Tuesday, her fever broken, her energy returned tenfold as if making up for lost time, and she greeted Marcus that evening with a smile so bright it seemed to illuminate the entire restaurant. Her crayon box clutched in both hands like a treasure. "Mr. Marcus," she said with the fearless directness of childhood. "Will you color with me tonight? You can sit at our table and we can make pictures together." The restaurant seemed to hold its breath. Every waiter pausing mid-step, Romano freezing behind the bar, Sarah's eyes widening with shock and mortification, all of them waiting for Marcus Sterling to politely decline, to retreat to his fortress at table 17, to restore the natural order of things. Marcus looked at Emma, at her hopeful face and outstretched hand, at the worn crayons and cheap coloring book, and heard himself say yes before his rational mind could intervene, the word emerging, quiet but certain. And suddenly he was standing and walking toward the modest staff table near the kitchen. Leaving behind his corner sanctuary for the first time in months, he folded his tall frame into the small chair across from Emma. His expensive suit incongruous against the simple furniture, his hands uncertain as they hovered over the crayon box she pushed toward him with generous enthusiasm. Emma chattered as they colored, her words tumbling out in the uninhibited way of 5-year-olds who have not yet learned that some people prefer silence, telling him about her kindergarten teacher, Miss Rodriguez, who smelled like flowers, about the stray cat that lived behind their apartment building, about how when she grew up she wanted to be an artist or maybe a veterinarian or possibly an astronaut, because why choose just one thing when the world was so full of possibilities? Marcus found himself listening, really listening, asking questions and receiving answers that made no logical sense but perfect emotional sense, and somewhere between coloring a purple elephant and hearing about Emma's theory that clouds were actually marshmallows, he smiled. A genuine smile that reached his eyes and transformed his entire face, and he realized, with shock, that he had forgotten how joy felt, how lightness tasted, how connection healed. Sarah stood several feet away with a tray of empty dishes, tears streaming silently down her face as she watched this powerful CEO whose name appeared in financial magazines coloring with her daughter, his walls crumbling with each crayon stroke. And every staff member in Romano's witnessed this impossible transformation, this modern miracle of a frozen heart beginning to thaw. The eviction notice arrived on a Friday afternoon, slipped under Sarah's apartment door like a knife sliding between ribs, informing her with bureaucratic coldness that her rent was increasing by $400 per month, effective immediately. An amount that might as well have been $4,000 for all the possibility she had of paying it. Sarah sat on her second-hand couch with the letter trembling in her hands, doing rapid calculations that all led to the same impossible conclusion. Her savings account holding barely enough for 2 weeks of food, her wages stretched so thin they were already transparent, no family to call, no safety net to catch them when they fell. She tried to hide her distress that evening at Romano's, forcing her smile into place. But her eyes were red-rimmed, and her hands shook when she poured water. And Marcus noticed immediately, his own meals forgotten as he watched her struggle through her shift. Emma sensed something was wrong. Her small face creased with confusion as she asked why Mommy looked so sad, and Sarah could only hold her daughter close and lie that everything would be fine, even as she made the devastating decision that night after Emma fell asleep, the only option left when all others had crumbled. The shelter on Oak Street had beds for families, not comfortable but safe, not permanent but better than the street, and Sarah would have to give her notice at Romano's, find work closer to the shelter, start over again in a neighborhood she did not know with a daughter who was finally settled and happy. She approached Mr. Romano with tears streaming down her face, explaining her situation, and he offered what help he could, but they both knew it was not enough. The gap between her wages and survival, too wide to bridge with kindness alone. When Sarah told Emma they were moving, that they would have to leave Romano's, Emma's face crumpled with a grief that seemed too large for such a small body, her voice breaking as she asked the question that shattered Sarah's heart completely. "But what about Mr. Marcus?" Emma sobbed. "He needs us. He's our friend. Who will make him smile if we leave?" Their last evening at the restaurant approached like an execution date, and Sarah moved through her final shift with mechanical numbness, while Emma sat at their table drawing one last picture for Marcus, her tears falling on the paper and smearing the crayon into watercolor sadness. Marcus arrived early that final evening, some instinct drawing him to Romano's before his usual time, and he heard Sarah's voice from the kitchen, where she stood with Mr. Romano. Her words carried through the partially open door with devastating clarity. The medical bills from when Emma was born, they never stop. She was premature, complications. I have been paying them for 5 years and will be paying them for 5 more. Every spare dollar goes into a savings account for her future because I will not let my circumstances become her ceiling. But now, with the eviction, I have to use that money just to survive. Marcus stood frozen in the hallway, his hand on the door to the dining room, listening as Sarah's voice cracked with exhaustion. I have sacrificed everything, worked until my body screams, denied myself anything beyond necessities, and still it is not enough. Still we are falling, and I do not know how to keep us afloat anymore. Mr. Romano's response was too quiet to hear, but Sarah's gratitude was evident even through her tears, and Marcus felt something inside him shift and crack, understanding suddenly the true depth of their struggle, the mathematical impossibility of surviving on wages that assumed people did not need food or shelter or medical care. The quiet heroism of a woman who maintained dignity while drowning. He walked to his table mechanically, his mind racing, and when Emma approached him with red-rimmed eyes and a folded piece of paper, Marcus took it with hands that shook with more than grief. The drawing showed 3 stick figures holding hands, carefully labeled in Emma's uneven writing, Mommy, Emma, and Mr. Marcus. Their smiles enormous, a heart drawn above them in red crayon. "You're our friend now," Emma said, her voice small and brave. "Friends don't forget friends." Right. Marcus stared at this child who had less than anyone he knew but gave more than anyone he had ever met, at this final gift that showed him included in a family he had not known he was joining, and he felt the last of his carefully constructed walls shatter completely. That night Marcus sat in his penthouse surrounded by Emma's drawings that covered his walls. The city lights blurring through tears he had not shed in 7 years, his phone in his hand, sleep impossible, his mind working with a focused intensity that had built empires. And for the first time since Laura and Thomas died, Marcus Sterling felt something more powerful than grief. Marcus sat surrounded by Emma's drawings at 3 in the morning, the city silent below him, and understood with sudden clarity that this child and her mother had performed a miracle he thought impossible. They had reached into his tomb of isolation and pulled him back into the world of the living, teaching him through simple gestures and genuine kindness that grief did not have to mean the end of joy, that loss did not require the sacrifice of all future connection, that honoring the dead meant living fully rather than joining them in a half-existence. Emma had asked if he was lonely with the innocent wisdom of someone too young to know the question was forbidden, and in doing so had shattered the lie Marcus had been telling himself for 7 years, the lie that he was fine, that he was functioning, that survival and living were the same thing. Sarah had shown him through her quiet dignity that strength was not the absence of struggle, but the choice to continue despite it. That grace under impossible circumstances was more admirable than success with every advantage, and Marcus realized he had spent 7 years confusing wealth with worth, power with purpose, achievement with meaning. He picked up his phone and called his personal assistant, not caring about the hour, his voice steady with decision. "Rachel, I need you to research housing options, family-friendly apartments near good schools. I want a list by morning. Also find me the best employment attorney in the city, someone who specializes in workers' rights and fair compensation, and get me all the information you can on medical debt relief programs." Rachel's confusion was evident, but she knew better than to question Marcus when he used that tone. And within hours, Marcus had a plan forming with the same strategic precision he applied to corporate acquisitions, except this time the goal was not profit but purpose, not expansion but redemption. He researched non-profit structures and charitable foundations, made calls to lawyers and accountants, put into motion plans that would have seemed impossible months ago when he was still frozen, still dead inside, still convinced that his life had ended on that rainy November evening 7 years past. For the first time since losing Laura and Thomas, Marcus felt purpose. beyond the empty accumulation of wealth and power, felt called to something greater than quarterly reports and shareholder meetings, and as dawn broke over the city, he looked at Emma's drawings covering his wall and knew exactly how to honor his son's memory, not by preserving grief like a monument, but by extending the kind of love Thomas had known to a child who desperately needed it. Marcus found them at the Oak Street shelter on Saturday morning. The building gray and institutional, families lined up outside with plastic bags containing their entire lives, and when Sarah saw him stepping out of his town car, she froze with confusion, and something that might have been hope before her dignity reasserted itself, and she lifted her chin with quiet pride. "Mr. Sterling, what are you doing here?" she asked, her hand instinctively reaching for Emma, who stood beside her clutching a worn stuffed rabbit. Marcus approached slowly, aware that he was stepping into sacred space, into the raw vulnerability of someone's lowest moment. "I have a position at Sterling Enterprises, community outreach coordinator, working with families in need, developing programs, managing resources. It comes with a salary 3 times what you were making, full benefits and housing assistance. We have corporate apartments for employees relocating." Sarah stared at him, her eyes filling with tears even as suspicion crept into her expression. "I don't want charity, Mr. Sterling. I have always worked for what we have." Marcus shook his head, his voice rough with emotion he no longer tried to hide. "This isn't charity. Sarah, you and Emma gave me back something I thought I'd lost forever when my family died. You taught me to feel again, to connect, to remember that life is more than just existing through each day. This is gratitude. And honestly, you would be helping me, because I'm also setting up a foundation in my son Thomas's name to help single parents, and I need someone who understands their struggles to run it. Someone with integrity and compassion and first-hand knowledge of what these families face." Sarah's hand went to her mouth, tears streaming freely now, her carefully maintained composure crumbling as Emma suddenly broke free and ran to Marcus, her small arms wrapping around his legs, her voice muffled against his expensive suit. "See, Mommy, I told you he was lonely like us," Emma said with the absolute certainty of childhood wisdom. "But now we can all be not lonely together." And Marcus knelt down to Emma's level, this powerful CEO who commanded boardrooms and influenced markets, and hugged this child who had saved his life with nothing more than crayons and courage, and the simple question about loneliness that had cracked open his frozen heart. 3 months passed like a healing season, winter giving way to early spring, and Sarah and Emma lived now in a 2-bedroom apartment with windows that let in actual sunlight, furniture that was not held together with hope and duct tape, a kitchen where Emma could help make cookies without worrying about the stove breaking, and most importantly, the kind of security that allowed Sarah to breathe without calculating every dollar, every meal, every impossible choice. Sarah thrived in her new role at Sterling Enterprises, her natural compassion and hard-won wisdom making her invaluable as she developed programs for single parents, connected families with resources, and spoke with the authority of someone who had lived the struggles she now worked to ease. Marcus was different now, transformed in ways that shocked everyone who had known the Ice King of Romano's restaurant. His smiles came easier, his laughter genuine when Emma told her rambling stories, and his presence at company meetings more engaged because he remembered that behind every policy decision were actual human lives that mattered more than profit margins. He visited Sarah and Emma regularly, sometimes joining them for dinner at their apartment where Emma insisted he sit in the special chair she had designated as his, sometimes taking them to Romano's where the staff watched with amazement as Marcus Sterling colored with crayons and laughed at a 5-year-old's jokes and seemed more alive than he had in the 7 years they had known him. Mr. Romano shook his head in wonder every time, telling anyone who would listen about the miracle he had witnessed, how a child's simple kindness had melted a frozen heart. Marcus had opened himself to friendship, to the messy, beautiful reality of surrogate family, to the understanding that love lost did not mean love finished, that Thomas and Laura would want him to honor their memory by living fully rather than building monuments to grief. He kept Emma's drawings on his office wall now, no longer hidden but displayed proudly. And when colleagues asked about them, he spoke of Thomas with sad smiles instead of silence, spoke of Laura with gratitude instead of devastation, and spoke of Emma and Sarah as the unexpected grace that had pulled him back from the edge of a life that was no life at all. 1 year later, the grand ballroom of the Meridian Hotel glittered with chandeliers and hope as 300 people gathered for the Thomas Sterling Foundation's first annual gala, an evening dedicated to supporting single parents and honoring the quiet heroes who raised children against impossible odds. Sarah stood at the podium in a simple but elegant dress, no longer the exhausted waitress in a stained uniform, but transformed by security and purpose into the confident woman she had always been beneath the weight of survival, and she told their story to a room full of strangers who wept openly at her words. She spoke of desperation and dignity, of a 5-year-old girl who noticed loneliness in a stranger's eyes, of kindness given without expectation of return, of how a crayon drawing had built a bridge between two broken families and created something whole. Emma, now 6 years old and radiant in her best dress, walked carefully to the stage carrying a crystal award, presenting it to her mother as the foundation's inaugural community champion, her voice clear and proud as she said, "Mommy helps people like us, people who need someone to believe in them." Marcus sat in the audience with tears streaming down his face, not caring who saw, remembering that first evening when Emma had approached his fortress of isolation and asked if he was lonely, that moment of innocent courage that had shattered walls 7 years in the building. And he understood now what Laura would have wanted, what Thomas would have smiled to see, that love multiplies rather than divides, that opening your heart after loss is not betrayal but the truest form of honor. We spend so much of our lives walking past each other, wrapped in our own worlds, our own pain, our own carefully constructed walls, never knowing that the person sitting alone might be drowning in isolation, that a simple gesture of connection might be the lifeline someone desperately needs. Emma saw what adults had trained themselves to ignore. She noticed loneliness and responded with the fearless compassion of childhood. And in doing so, she saved not just Marcus but also herself and her mother, because kindness is never a one-way street. It circles back and lifts everyone it touches. The evening ended with Marcus, Sarah, and Emma standing together as photographers captured the moment, this found family, born from loss and kindness, and the courage to reach across the invisible barriers that separate us. Proof that we all need connection, that wealth means nothing without love, that the smallest act of noticing someone's pain can change everything. So look around you. See the people eating alone, sitting in silence, wearing smiles that don't reach their eyes, and remember that your simple gesture, your moment of courage, your willingness to ask if someone is lonely might be exactly what saves them, might crack open a frozen heart, might build a family where before there was only isolation, because in the end we are all just humans searching for connection, and the kindest thing we can do is reach out our hand and refuse to let each other face this world alone.